Hey guys, tonight we begin with something a little different. Not kings or queens this time, although, of course, they'll make a cameo later in the subtle, indirect sort of way we like. Tonight we going to drift back to a world where the line between the ordinary and the utterly fantastical was very, very thin. A world where snakes were not just pests in the garden or roadside annoyances, but divine creatures deserving of worship. Where gorillas, or at least creatures that looked vaguely like them, could be gods, or messengers from gods. And where people might glance at a shadow in the forest and quietly, solemnly decide, yes, that is sacred, and maybe a little terrifying, but mostly sacred. So, dim the lights, get cozy, and let's float into the quiet, serpentine, sometimes fur-covered corners of human belief. Let's begin, unsurprisingly, with snakes. Snakes have had an almost absurdly long career as divine or supernatural beings. They slither through the mythology of practically every early civilization, from Egypt to Mesopotamia to Mesoamerica. In ancient Egypt, for example, the cobra wasn't just a snake. It was the uraeus, the protective emblem worn on the crowns of pharaohs. So, imagine being a pharaoh. You've got armies, taxes, diplomats, and a small personal crisis every morning about which royal robe to wear. And on top of that, you've got this cobra stitched into your crown. That cobra, by the way, is expected to spit a little divine venom at anyone foolish enough to challenge your authority. Or, in more practical terms, it's supposed to make them feel uncomfortable. Subtle intimidation, very low maintenance. But the Egyptians were nothing if not thorough. They had gods like Wadjet, a protective cobra goddess, who supposedly watched over Lower Egypt. If you were an ancient Egyptian walking through the streets of, say, Memphis, it wasn't unusual to see her image everywhere, on jewelry, on temple walls, even on tiny amulets worn around the neck to protect the wearer. People genuinely believed a snake-shaped charm could prevent illness, protect children, or maybe even make a bad crop season slightly less miserable. And yes, sometimes the snake would appear alive. Priests would occasionally parade live snakes during festivals. You can almost hear someone muttering, "Well, I hope it doesn't bite the pharaoh today." But that's why we have priests. Meanwhile, in Mesopotamia, snakes had a slightly different flavor. They were connected to healing and immortality. Nabu, the god of wisdom, sometimes shared his serpentine symbolism with medical practices. Temples of healing sometimes displayed snake imagery, probably hoping patients would get better, or at least feel slightly more reassured that the divine was watching over their slightly feverish selves. And let us not forget the double-edged nature of snakes in Mesopotamia. They were both protectors and symbols of chaos, which is very human if you think about it. We all like pets until they hiss at us unexpectedly. If you drift over to Mesoamerica, snakes become, frankly, spectacularly dramatic. The Aztec deity, Quetzalcoatl, feathered serpent extraordinaire, is basically the rock star of snake gods. Imagine a massive, scaly, feathered snake casually drifting across the skies, giving gifts of maize and civilization itself. And then imagine your average Aztec citizen thinking, well, that seems safe enough. I guess we'll offer some ceremonial treats, which, if you're offering ceremonial treats to a flying feathered snake, probably involves a lot of incense, maize, and maybe a quiet whisper to the deity, like, "Hope you enjoy this." The Aztecs treated Quetzalcoatl with a mixture of awe, fear, and the sort of resigned devotion you might feel toward an eccentric, very demanding uncle. Let's float over to Africa for a moment, particularly Central Africa, where gorillazor creatures resembling them took on a divine quality in the beliefs of certain early communities. The concept here isn't always clear-cut. There aren't extensive written records, so modern historians rely on oral traditions, carvings, and scattered references. But it seems that the gorilla, with its human-like demeanor yet formidable strength, was sometimes considered a messenger from the spirit world. If a villager happened upon a gorilla in the forestalone.com, staring this wasn't necessarily a frightening moment. More often, it was a quiet, respectful encounter, interpreted as divine communication. And yes, it's possible they might have slightly overfed the local gorilla population with offerings of fruit, just in case the spirits were hungry, which, from a distance, probably looked like a polite wildlife feeding program. Across the Indian subcontinent, we encounter more hybrid or vaguely mythical creatures. Naga, semi-divine serpents, appear in countless myths, sometimes offering protection, sometimes delivering punishment. Naga could dwell in rivers, caves, or trees, and locals would leave offerings before fishing or crossing rivers. It's tempting to imagine people politely tossing fruit into the water while thinking, "Sorry, Naga, we really just need the fish today." No offense. The Naga were also guardians of treasures, secret knowledge, and sometimes mystical gateways. So, appeasing them had a practical side too, preventing people from losing a day's worth of labor to a puddle or, worse, to divine displeasure. Interestingly, the worship of animals or semi-animal deities wasn't always symbolic. In many cases, it was extremely practical. Take crocodiles, for instance, another favorite of the Egyptians. Sobek, the crocodile god, could be both terrifying and protective. People fed live crocodiles at temples. Priests sometimes walked around, making sure the crocodiles were well fed, presumably to avoid any unfortunate biting incidents during daily life. There's a recurring pattern here. Humans tend to ritualize danger. Dangerous animals become sacred. Dangerous gods become domesticated through ceremony. It's a slow, careful negotiation with nature and myth. Very soothing if you think about it in bed, honestly. And while we're drifting lazily across continents, let's not forget the Pacific Islands, where people sometimes revered unknown or fantastical creatures that were more imagined than real. These might be fish, birds, or hybrid creatures, often depicted in carvings or tattoos. In many cases, the creature wasn't just worshipped, it also dictated daily routines. A fisherman might decide to go one day, but not the next, based on whether he felt the creature was in a good mood, which is perhaps the earliest form of consulting mood-based app alerts. Today's oracle says stay home. Good call, Bob. You would have tipped the canoe. Now, you might be thinking, this all sounds a bit fanciful. But surely these civilizations weren't just inventing creatures for fun. And, of course, you're right. These beliefs often arose from practical observation, fear, and the human need to explain things. Snakes, gorillas, crocodiles, unusual birds, all these creatures were extraordinary to people living without modern science. So attributing divine qualities to them was a way to create order in an unpredictable world. If a snake bites, it's not just a random accident, it's a message. If a gorilla disappears silently into the forest, perhaps it's a blessing. This system of meaning-making is, at its core, deeply human. and oddly soothing once you let go of the expectation that everything must be mundane or logical. And of course, we can't ignore the personal, almost trivial interactions that people had with these divine creatures. There are records, sparse as they may be, of priests who kept snakes in their homes. Sometimes these snakes escaped. Sometimes villagers had to politely chase them back into the temple. Sometimes the snake was fine, and the priest had a minor heart attack. Life went on. Similarly, offerings to gorilla-like spirits might be as simple as leaving a banana or two on a path. These small, quiet rituals were the spiritual equivalent of tidying your desk, a gentle reassurance that things were in order, that the universe was, in some tiny way, politely acknowledging your existence. Of course, we also have to address the slightly darker side of these beliefs. Some creatures were worshipped because they were feared. Worship and fear are very closely linked in ancient religion. If you respect the creature, it won't harm you. If you disrespect it, well, let's just say there are stories slightly muted in tone of villages avoiding certain rivers, caves, or forests for generations because a spirit or animal had spoken once, and the echo was apparently sufficient to last decades. Humans being what we are, stories grow with retellings. A 1-meter-long snake might become 20 meters over time, and the cautious respect is maintained. Very cozy in a slightly tense way. Perfect for a bedtime story if your mind enjoys slow, creeping unease. Let's float over to China for a moment, where dragons, which are essentially giant serpentine creatures with questionable physical plausibility, dominated early mythology. The Chinese dragon wasn't malevolent in the way Western dragons sometimes are. No, these dragons were generally helpful. They controlled rain, rivers, and floods. Farmers adored them quietly and offered modest sacrifices during droughts. Imagine being a farmer staring at a parched field, muttering, "Dear dragon, a little water would be great. Don't want to inconvenience you, but we do need our crops." That blend of humility, hope, and quiet negotiation with the supernatural is almost hypnotic if you read it slowly. And, finally, let's drift gently into the idea that some of these creatures were entirely mythical, yet their worship had real-world consequences. Communities might plan entire festivals, labor cycles, or agricultural practices around a creature that never existed outside imagination. And yet, for centuries, this structured, repetitive engagement with myth provided rhythm to life, reassurance in uncertainty, and a very gentle, persistent sense of purpose. There's something almost lullaby in that repetition, a quiet cadence of devotion and expectation that is both human and oddly calming. So tonight, as we let our minds trace the slow, sinuous forms of snakes, gorillas, and feathered serpents across time and space, consider this. Ancient people were in a sense whispering to the unknown, negotiating small deals with the world around them, and finding comfort in that quiet, cautious reverence. Their gods slithered, swung, or flew, but they weren't all terrifying. They were companions in the slow, uncertain journey of existence. And maybe, just maybe, thinking about them in this soft, measured way will carry you gently toward sleep. As you imagine tiny offerings left on forest paths, temple floors, and riverbanks, everyone, I hope you found a comfortable spot. Maybe a blanket, maybe a slightly judgmental cat staring at you from across the room, ready to silently supervise your descent into myth and history. Tonight, we continue drifting through the quieter, stranger corners of human belief. We left off with serpents, gorillas, dragons, and feathered serpents. Now, let's wander gently toward other creatures, some real, some imagined, and some that probably make zoologists sigh quietly. One of the most fascinating things about ancient belief systems is that people didn't necessarily distinguish sharply between animal and God. The two categories could overlap, wobble into each other, and even switch places entirely depending on context. Take birds, for instance. In many early civilizations, large or unusual birds were revered as messengers of the gods. In Egypt, the ibis was sacred to Thoth, god of wisdom and writing. Imagine being a scribe in ancient Thebes, trying to finish a scroll before the sun sets, while thinking, better not annoy the ibis. They're watching, and Thoth is very particular about these things. And if a wild ibis happened to wander into the marketplace, it wasn't just a bird. It was a small, winged bureaucrat keeping tabs on your life. Meanwhile, across the Mediterranean, the Greeks were similarly obsessed with birds, though they often leaned into divination. Ravens, owls, and eagles carried messages from the gods, predicted outcomes of battles, or generally judged humans for minor social failings. The owl, famously associated with Athena, symbolized wisdom, though it may have also caused mild panic if it appeared suddenly on the roof at night. Imagine a group of ancient Athenians quietly shuffling home from the market, glancing up and thinking, "Ah, the owl approves." Or not, hard to say. That mixture of uncertainty and quiet reverence is exactly the kind of gentle tension humans seemed to enjoy when contemplating the divine. Let's glide now to Central and South America, where animals like jaguars, monkeys, and birds were not only gods, but central players in cosmology. The Maya, for instance, believed jaguars were guardians of the underworld. They were sleek, powerful, and silently terrifying, perfect for a deity that guarded the afterlife. And yet, they were also adored, offered small tributes, and sometimes even carved into stone monuments that probably doubled as architectural decoration and subtle reminders of mortality. And in case you were wondering, the jaguar was not particularly interested in paperwork or taxes. So that's a plus for the mortal worshippers. Monkeys also appeared in Mesoamerican belief systems, particularly as tricksters or mischievous spirits. People might attribute minor mischiefs, field food, lost tools, children getting distracted, to these playful deities, which, if you think about it, is remarkably similar to blaming squirrels for garden mishaps today. Humans have a long history of politely assigning blame to creatures that can't respond in court. That's comforting. It creates a slow narrative rhythm to life, where accidents have meaning, and meaning is just soft enough to soothe the soul. If we float eastward again, the Hindu pantheon gives us a particularly interesting case with Hanuman, the monkey god. Hanuman is strong, clever, loyal, and generally exhausting if you try to imagine meeting him in real life. Yet devotion to Hanuman often involved quiet daily rituals, foring fruit, reciting simple prayers, or slightly muttering complaints about how inconvenient monkeys can be. And while this may sound mildly chaotic to a modern observer, for centuries it provided a comforting framework. Small acts of reverence could, in theory, make the world slightly more predictable, and predictability, as we know, is very relaxing. Now, back to Africa for a moment, where water spirits often took animal forms. The mummy Wata, for instance, is depicted as part human, part fish, sometimes with snakes in her hair. sometimes surrounded by exotic animals. People left offerings along riverbanks, hoping for protection, fertility, or mild financial improvement. There's something almost soothing in the repetition of these acts. A coin in the river. Even if the water spirit didn't respond directly, the ritual itself created rhythm, small control, and a quiet acknowledgement of human vulnerability. We should also take a moment to appreciate that these creatures were often mirrors of human hopes and fears. Take dragons again, or other serpentine gods in Asia. They controlled weather. Rain could be plentiful or scarce. Crops could flourish or fail. And yet, the ritual response, fall offerings, polite prayers, minor sacrifices gave communities a sense of agency, however symbolic. Imagine being a farmer. You can't control the weather, but you can mutter into the wind while sprinkling a few grains onto a stone altar. It's satisfying. You've done your part. And of course, we can't overlook hybrid creatures that were part real, part imagined. Many ancient myths describe lions with wings, serpents with human faces, or fish with bird beaks. Why? Well, humans have vivid imaginations, and these creatures served multiple purposes. They warned, taught, inspired, awe, and sometimes made architecture more interesting. Temples were decorated with these hybrids, and people would pass by daily, subconsciously absorbing lessons about divine power, morality, or just the occasional reminder not to leave the bread out in the sun. Small, practical, and comforting. Let's drift gently into the quieter, almost mundane side of interacting with these creatures. Priests, shamans, and everyday worshippers often had routines that involved waking up early, carefully arranging small offerings, and whispering to statues or live animals. A snake might be fed. A monkey represented in clay might receive a tiny painted fruit, or a riverbank spirit might get a carefully tossed flower. Life itself was wrapped in ritual, and ritual, if you read it slowly, is very calming. It creates patterns, repetition, and a gentle, rhythmic reassurance that the world has order even if that order comes from a feathered serpent in the sky or a half-imagined gorilla in the forest. Some ancient rituals were quietly elaborate. In parts of the Pacific, offerings to sea spirits included small boats laden with flowers, food, and occasionally a symbolic coin. People would watch from the shore, making sure the currents carried the offering gently away. There was no drama, no spectacular firework display, just the soft sound of water, the quiet movement of a tiny vessel, and a gentle hope that spirits were noticing. That, in itself, could provide hours of soothing contemplation, perfect for a bedtime mind to follow. And yet, it wasn't all serenity. Some divine creatures carried small doses of anxiety, enough to keep life interesting in a low-stakes way. A snake that wasn't fed correctly might bring misfortune. A river spirit might look displeased if you overfished. A jaguar deity might frown on laziness. They were soft, like a dull buzzing in the background, just enough to make you pay attention, just enough to encourage care and attentiveness without prompting panic. By this point, we can see a pattern emerging across continents, centuries, and cultures. Humans consistently found ways to make the unknown gentle, predictable, and vaguely reassuring. Imagined hybrids structured daily life. Ritual, repetition, and polite offerings created rhythm. And quietly, these practices provided comfort, as well as a subtle thrill of living in a world slightly larger, stranger, and more mysterious than what your eyes could immediately perceive. So, as we continue this journey Think about the small, quiet ways humans negotiated with the unknown. Not with swords or fire, not with spectacle or violence, but with whispers, tiny offerings, and daily routines. There is a slow poetry in that, a gentle cadence that drifts alongside the mind, softening the edges of consciousness. And if you've made it this far while lying in bed, perhaps your eyelids are growing heavy, your mind tracing gentle arcs across rivers, forests, and skies inhabited by feathered serpents, silent gorillas, and mildly judgmental dragons.